In 2002, an American entrepreneur named Michael Kovac walked through U.S. Customs carrying a suitcase. Tucked inside, hidden among his clothes, were 3 large purple slipper orchids he'd purchased from a roadside stand in Peru. He didn't have permits for them. When he took one to botanical experts in Florida, they realized he had smuggled in a species of Phagmipedium entirely unknown to science. Within days of the discovery, Kovac was facing federal investigations and the threat of a prison sentence for breaking international treaties. But the real chaos happened back in Peru. By the time authorities tried to secure the area where the flower was first found, plant poachers had already ripped all 500 wild specimens out of the ground. They were funneled directly into the black market, quietly selling to private collectors for up to $10,000 apiece. This kind of frenzy happens repeatedly in the world of high-end horticulture. In his research on the subject, author Eric Hansen recorded a conversation with a commercial grower who laid out the reality of the trade. He said, "You can get off alcohol, drugs, women, food, and cars, but once you're hooked on orchids, you're finished. You never get off orchids. Never." That addiction fuels an illicit global economy. Every year, an estimated $6 billion worth of illegally collected orchids move through a shadow market. The supply routes and smuggling methods heavily mirror the international trafficking of narcotics and weapons. We tend to think of these plants as delicate, decorative items sitting on a windowsill. The reality is that they are a highly controlled, deeply addictive commodity, one that consistently drives people to risk their freedom and ruin their lives just to possess a single new bloom. The relationship between humans and this plant didn't start with aesthetics. 4,000 years ago, orchids were harvested strictly for utility. The earliest written records come from China, where the legendary scholar and emperor Shen Nung cataloged them purely as a functional medicine. This pragmatic approach spanned the ancient world. Archaeologists have found clay tablets from the royal library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, listing orchid roots alongside dates and figs as harvested crops. Middle Eastern apothecaries regularly ground the dense, underground tubers of terrestrial orchids into a flour to use as a high-yield food source. That flour was frequently brewed into a highly nutritious beverage known as salep. The drink was so effective at sustaining human health that millennia later, during his massive 18th-century naval voyages, Captain James Cook carried a supply of salep to help cure his crew of scurvy. For most of human history, a person looked at an orchid and saw a practical, life-saving root system. We need to look at exactly how and why that perception inverted, turning a vital survival tool into a dangerous, irrational obsession with cosmetic petals. The pivot from medicine to obsession actually began in the dirt, driven by the physical appearance of the terrestrial orchid's root system. Many orchids produce 2 fleshy ovoid tubers. Around 300 BC, Theophrastus named this feature orchis, ancient Greek for testicle. This collided with the doctrine of signatures, the medieval belief that a plant's physical shape is a divine clue to its medical capabilities. Because the roots resembled human anatomy, the logic of the time dictated that they must cure ailments related to male virility. Medieval apothecaries and folk healers began prescribing the fresh tubers to stimulate generative power, and they quickly became the primary ingredient in illicit love potions. That single anatomical coincidence shifted the plant's cultural trajectory. It was no longer a reliable flour for bread or a cure for scurvy. It had become intimately associated with human lust. By the 18th and 19th centuries, that early fascination morphed into outright hysteria, a period historically labeled as orchid delirium, or orchid fever. European explorers mapped the tropical zones of the New World, sending back exotic, brightly colored species that looked nothing like the terrestrial plants of Europe. Wealthy European elites began constructing massive glass conservatories strictly to house these imported blooms. Supplying those greenhouses required a new kind of mercenary explorer, the orchid hunter. These men traveled deep into unmapped tropical regions, risking venomous reptiles, unfamiliar tropical diseases, and pirate attacks, all to extract rare flowers for European aristocrats. Because the payouts were so high, these hunters developed a tactic known as the vandalism of greed. When an expedition found an undiscovered species, they harvested every specimen they could physically load onto their ships. Then, to prevent competition, they would deliberately tear down the remaining wild habitats or throw them into fires. They intentionally drove newly discovered species to the brink of extinction within days of finding them. By ensuring that competing hunters couldn't bring the same flower back to London or Paris, they created severe artificial scarcity, forcing the auction prices for their cargo to astronomical heights. The strategy worked perfectly. By manufacturing rarity, these explorers entirely erased the orchid's history as a functional, life-sustaining crop. They repackaged it into the ultimate symbol of extreme wealth and exclusivity. As orchid fever peaked, the scientific community stepped in to demystify the plant. In 1862, Charles Darwin published a detailed study on orchids, proving their bizarre floral structures were flawless evolutionary adaptations designed specifically to attract pollinating insects. Other botanists tackled the mystery of reproduction. For decades, greenhouses failed to grow orchids from seed. But researchers like Noel Bernard and Louis Knudsen eventually discovered that orchid seeds lack their own nutrient reserves, requiring a symbiotic relationship with highly specific soil fungi to germinate. Once scientists understood the exact biological constraints of the plant, they bypassed them entirely. By the mid-20th century, horticulturalists developed advanced tissue culture methods, allowing them to clone and hybridize plants in sterile lab environments. The orchid was extracted from the tropical jungle and placed onto the factory floor. Today, horticultural giants in the United States and the Netherlands mass-produce millions of specimens every year. Plants that once cost a Victorian lord a small fortune are now genetically identical, mass-market clones, sitting near the checkout aisles of everyday grocery stores. The industrialization of the orchid successfully eliminated its scarcity. By basic economic logic, flooding the market with cheap, beautiful clones should have permanently cured the world of orchid fever. Instead, mass production simply fractured the market. While the general public is perfectly happy buying supermarket clones, the highest tier of collectors completely rejects them. Their desire has nothing to do with the simple beauty of a petal. They crave the undiscovered, the wild harvested, and the strictly illegal. It is exactly that demand for exclusivity that pushes smugglers like Michael Kovac to pack unknown species into their luggage. The elite rejection of the laboratory clone is the direct funding mechanism for today's $6 billion black market. Over the last 4 millennia, the underlying biology of the orchid hasn't changed at all, but our relationship with it has. It went from a reliable source of ancient flower to a manufactured symbol of extreme status. The flower merely acted as a mirror, showing us that the most dangerous, uncontrollable force in the natural world is our own obsession.